The capture. The spring of 1945 arrived cold and unforgiving across the German countryside. Greta Hoffmann pressed herself against the brick wall of the munitions factory, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At 23, she had spent the last 2 years working as a communications officer for the Wehrmacht, far from the front lines, but close enough to understand that Germany's thousand-year Reich was crumbling faster than anyone dared speak aloud. "They're coming," whispered Anneliese, her closest friend and fellow officer. Through the shattered windows of the factory, they could hear the rumble of tanks, distinctly different from the German panzers they'd grown accustomed to. These were American Shermans, and they were getting closer. Greta thought of her last meal. A thin soup made from potato peels and a slice of black bread, so hard it had nearly broken her tooth. For months, rations had dwindled to almost nothing. The factory workers had been subsisting on ersatz coffee made from acorns and whatever vegetables they could scavenge from abandoned gardens. Her stomach had long ago stopped growling. Hunger had become simply another condition of existence, like the cold or the constant fear. The factory commander, Hauptmann Weber, had fled 2 days ago, leaving behind a skeleton crew of women who had nowhere else to go. Some had families in the surrounding towns, but most, like Greta, came from cities that no longer existed, reduced to rubble by Allied bombing campaigns. Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, the list grew longer each week. "What do we do?" asked Margit, barely 18 and trembling despite the thick wool coat wrapped around her thin frame. Her eyes, once bright and full of the fervor that the Hitler youth had instilled in her, now held only exhaustion and fear. Greta surveyed the room. 15 women remained, ranging from Margit's 18 years to Frau Dietrich's 52. They were telegraphists, clerks, nurses, and administrators. Not soldiers, though they wore the gray-green uniforms of the Wehrmacht. None of them had weapons. Even if they had, what would be the point? "We wait," Greta said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "And we surrender." The word felt strange on her tongue. For years, they had been taught that surrender was cowardice, that death was preferable to capture. But Greta had stopped believing in propaganda, somewhere between the fall of Stalingrad and the moment she'd watched a 10-year-old boy march past her window with a Panzerfaust on his shoulder, sent to die against Soviet tanks. The rumbling stopped. In the terrible silence that followed, Greta could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the collective held breath of every woman in that room. Then came voices in English, sharp commands echoing through the factory complex. "Hands up! Come out slowly!" Greta stood first, raising her hands above her head. One by one, the others followed her lead. They filed out of the building into the weak morning sunlight, blinking against the brightness. American soldiers surrounded them, weapons raised but expressions more curious than hostile. A young lieutenant approached, probably no older than Greta herself. He had red hair and freckles and looked like he belonged on a farm somewhere, not in the ruins of Nazi Germany. He spoke in carefully enunciated German. "You are now prisoners of the United States Army. You will not be harmed if you cooperate." Greta found herself laughing, a short, bitter sound that surprised even her. Not harmed. They were already harmed. Germany itself was one great wound, bleeding out across Europe. What more could possibly be done to them? But as the Americans began to lead them toward waiting trucks, Greta noticed something that made her pause. The soldiers, these enemies who should have been monsters according to every poster and radio broadcast she'd heard for years, were handing out cigarettes and chocolate bars. Real chocolate. One soldier offered his canteen to Frau Dietrich, who was struggling to walk. In that moment, watching an American GI help an elderly German woman into a truck with unexpected gentleness, Greta realized that everything was about to change. The war was ending, and whatever came next would be unlike anything she could imagine. She had no idea how right she was. The journey. The truck bed was cramped but not uncomfortable, certainly better than many of the conditions Greta had endured over the past year. 15 women sat pressed together, swaying with the motion of the vehicle as it rumbled westward along roads pocked with shell craters. 2 American guards sat with them, young men who looked more nervous than threatening, their rifles held loosely across their laps. Annalise leaned close to Greta, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Where do you think they're taking us?" "A POW camp, I suppose," Greta replied, though truthfully, she had no idea what to expect. Stories about enemy prisoner camps had circulated throughout the war, horror stories designed to make German soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender. But looking at these young American soldiers with their clean uniforms and well-fed faces, Greta found it hard to reconcile reality with propaganda. One of the guards, noticing their conversation, pulled out a pack of Wrigley's chewing gum and offered it around. Most of the women stared at it with suspicion, but young Margaret, always the boldest despite her fear, accepted a stick. She unwrapped it carefully, as if it might explode, then cautiously placed it in her mouth. Her eyes widened. "It's sweet," she whispered in amazement. "And it doesn't disappear." The guard smiled, not understanding her German words, but recognizing the universal expression of delight. He distributed the rest of the pack among the women. Greta took a piece, more to be polite than from any real desire. When she began to chew, she understood Margaret's reaction. She couldn't remember the last time she'd tasted something purely for pleasure rather than survival. Through the canvas cover of the truck, Greta caught glimpses of the passing landscape. The war had left its mark everywhere. Burned-out tanks, shattered buildings, fields torn up by artillery. But she also saw American supply columns stretching as far as the eye could see, trucks laden with equipment, fuel, and what looked like crates upon crates of supplies. The sheer abundance was staggering. "They haven't been starving," observed Frau Dietrich quietly, following Greta's gaze. "Look at them. Look at their trucks, their equipment. Everything is new, plentiful." It was true. Even the American guards escorting them looked well-nourished, their uniforms intact and properly fitted. By contrast, Greta and her companions were gaunt, their uniforms threadbare and patched, their boots held together with wire and hope. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. The truck slowed, joining a long convoy of military vehicles. Through the canvas, Greta heard someone speaking English with an accent she couldn't quite place. Then came the unmistakable sound of laughter. Actual laughter. It seemed absurd. They were in the middle of a war zone, surrounded by death and destruction. Yet these Americans laughed as if they were on some kind of adventure. After several hours, the truck came to a complete stop. The canvas was pulled back, revealing a large compound surrounded by wire fencing. But it wasn't the grim, threatening prison Greta had imagined. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, and she could see other prisoners, both men and women, walking around freely within the compound boundaries. American flags flew from several poles, snapping in the spring breeze. "Everyone out," commanded the red-haired lieutenant from earlier, his German still careful but understandable. "You'll be processed and assigned quarters. Medical examination first, then food." Food. The word sent a ripple through the group. What kind of food? Greta wondered. More than soup? Black bread? Her stomach, dormant for so long, suddenly made itself known with a painful rumble. They were led into a processing building where American soldiers, both male and female, sat at desks with forms and typewriters. The efficiency was impressive. Each woman was asked questions, name, rank, unit, hometown, all recorded with mechanical precision. When it was Greta's turn, the American clerk, a woman about her own age with dark hair and bright red lipstick, smiled at her. "Don't worry," she said in heavily accented German. "You're safe now." Safe. Another word that felt foreign. Greta hadn't felt safe since 1939. The medical examination was thorough, but not invasive. An American doctor, an older man with kind eyes, checked their vital signs, looked for wounds or illnesses, and made notes on a chart. When he checked Greta's weight, he frowned and spoke to a nurse in rapid English. The nurse nodded sympathetically. "Malnourished," the doctor said in German, shaking his head. "But we'll fix that. Don't worry." Finally, they were taken to a barracks where bunks had been prepared with clean sheets and wool blankets. Real blankets, thick and warm, not the thin, moth-eaten things they'd been using at the factory. Greta sat on her assigned bunk, running her hand over the fabric in wonder. They said food was next, Annalise reminded her, sitting on the adjacent bunk. Her eyes held a mixture of hope and apprehension. I wonder what they'll give us. None of them could have possibly guessed. The dining hall. The dining hall was unlike anything Greta had ever seen in a military facility. Long tables with benches stretched across the room, all clean and orderly. American soldiers moved about with trays, and the noise of conversation, even some laughter, filled the space. But what struck Greta most profoundly was the smell. Food, real food, the scent of cooking meat, fresh bread, and something else she couldn't quite identify, but which made her mouth water instantly. It was overwhelming after years of ersatz, everything and rations that had dwindled to near nothing. An American officer, a woman in her 30s with a kind but no-nonsense demeanor, addressed them in competent German. I'm Lieutenant Morrison. You'll line up here with trays. Take what you want from the serving line. There's plenty for everyone. Plenty for everyone. The phrase seemed almost absurd. Greta glanced at her companions. They all wore the same expression of disbelief mingled with desperate hope. They formed a line, each taking a metal tray divided into sections. As they shuffled forward, Greta could see the serving stations. Her breath caught. Steam tables held food, actual, identifiable food. A woman in a white uniform stood behind the first station with a large spoon. Mashed potatoes? She asked cheerfully in English, not waiting for an answer before scooping a generous portion onto Greta's tray. Real potatoes, creamy and white, with butter melting into them. Butter. When had Greta last seen real butter? The next station held meat. Roast beef, sliced thick with gravy. The server added 2 large slices to her tray without being asked. Then came green beans, glistening with more butter. Bread rolls, soft and white, not the dense black bread she'd grown accustomed to. A pat of butter on the side. A small bowl of fruit cocktail, peaches and pears and sweet syrup. And finally, at the end of the line, the server added a small carton of milk and a cup of coffee. Real coffee, Greta realized from the aroma, not the acorn-based substitute that had become standard in Germany. By the time she reached the end of the serving line, Greta's tray was so full she worried she might drop it. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked for a place to sit. Around her, the other German women stood frozen, staring at their trays in absolute shock. Is this real?" whispered Margit, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her young face as she looked at the food before her. Frau Dietrich sat down heavily on a bench, her own tray clutched in shaking hands. "Mein Gott," she breathed. "So much. There's so much." Greta took a seat at one of the long tables, carefully setting down her tray. She stared at it, almost afraid to begin. The mashed potatoes alone were more than she'd typically eaten in an entire day back at the factory. The meat, she'd almost forgotten what beef tasted like. For the past 2 years, meat had mint horse when they were lucky, or mystery sausage made from God knew what when they weren't. Annalise sat beside her, picking up her fork but not yet eating. "How is this possible?" she asked. "Don't they understand there's a war on? How can they have so much?" "America," said a voice behind them. They turned to find an older German woman, already a prisoner for some weeks based on her slightly better appearance. America was never bombed. Their factories, their farms, everything kept producing. They have more food than they know what to do with. Greta looked around the dining hall again, seeing it with new understanding. American soldiers sat at nearby tables, eating the same food, talking casually. This wasn't a special meal designed to impress prisoners. This was normal. This was what they ate every day. She picked up her fork and cut into the roast beef. The meat was tender, yielding easily. She brought it to her mouth, and the taste exploded across her tongue. Rich, savory, real. She had to close her eyes against the sudden rush of emotion. Around the table, similar scenes played out. Margit was crying openly as she ate, unable to stop either the tears or the eating. Frau Dietrich kept whispering prayers of thanks between bites. Annalise ate methodically, as if afraid the food would vanish if she ate too quickly. "Slow down," Lieutenant Morrison warned in German, moving among the tables. "I know it's hard, but you need to eat slowly. Your stomachs aren't used to this much food. You'll make yourself sick if you're not careful. But it was almost impossible to follow that advice. After years of hunger, faced with abundance, the body's instincts took over. Greta forced herself to pause between bites, sipping the milk, cold and creamy, to pace herself. The milk. She couldn't get over the milk. In Germany, milk had been reserved for children and the very ill. Adults drank ersatz coffee or water. But here was a full carton of fresh, cold milk just for her. They called this lunch, Greta said suddenly, the absurdity of it hitting her. This is what they consider lunch. The words hung in the air. If this was lunch, a casual, everyday meal, what did dinner look like? What about breakfast? The implications were staggering. Aftermath. That first night in the American POW camp, Greta lay in her bunk, unable to sleep despite the comfortable mattress and warm blankets. Her stomach hurt, not from hunger for the first time in years, but from fullness. Lieutenant Morrison's warning had been prophetic. Several of the women had indeed made themselves ill from eating too much too quickly. In the darkness, she could hear others stirring, similarly unable to rest. Soft conversation drifted through the barracks. "I can't believe that was real," someone whispered. "Real meat, real butter, real bread. My daughter," came Frau Dietrich's voice, thick with emotion. "My little Helga in Berlin. She's 7 now. I wonder if she's had real milk even once this year." The comment brought a heavy silence. They were all thinking of those they'd left behind. Family members still in Germany, still facing shortages, still scrounging for survival. And here they were, prisoners, eating better than they had in years. "Is it propaganda?" asked another voice. Greta recognized it as Clara, a former nurse. "Are they feeding us well to make us, I don't know, compliant? Grateful? Does it matter?" responded Annalise. "Whatever the reason, I'm not going to refuse food." Greta turned over, staring at the ceiling. It was a fair question, though. Why were the Americans treating them so well? Throughout the war, they'd been told that capture meant torture, starvation, possibly death. Instead, they'd been given medical care, clean quarters, and food that exceeded anything they'd seen even before the war started. She thought back to those first weeks of the war in 1939, when Germany seemed unstoppable and the future looked bright for the Reich. Even then, even in those early days of victory, food had never been as abundant as what she'd seen in that American dining hall today. The butter alone. She couldn't remember ever having as much butter as the Americans casually served with a single meal. In the morning, Greta woke to reveille played over loudspeakers. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The barracks were warmer than the factory had been, and she'd actually slept deeply for the first time in months. "Breakfast in 30 minutes, announced Lieutenant Morrison, walking through the barracks. "Showers are available in the facility next door. Clean uniforms will be provided. Showers, hot water, clean clothes." The small luxuries kept accumulating, each one a reminder of how far they had fallen in Germany and how vast the gap had grown between their reality and America's. The showers were indeed hot, with real soap that lathered and smelled of flowers. Greta stood under the spray longer than necessary, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. When had she last been truly warm and clean at the same time? The clean uniforms turned out to be simple work clothes, cotton dresses in neutral colors, far more comfortable than the wool military uniforms they'd been wearing. There were even undergarments, new and properly fitted. And then came breakfast. If lunch had been shocking, breakfast was almost beyond comprehension. Eggs, real eggs, fried and scrambled. Bacon, crispy and glistening with fat. Toast with jam. Orange juice. Oatmeal with brown sugar. Coffee with real cream and sugar. The portions were, once again, generous to the point of seeming wasteful. Greta sat with her tray, trying to process what she was seeing. In Germany, eggs had become so rare that they were traded like currency. Bacon was a memory from before the war. Orange juice? She couldn't remember ever having orange juice, even as a child. "I had 6 eggs last year," said Annalise quietly, staring at the 2 fried eggs on her plate. 6 eggs in all of 1944. And here they are, just giving us 2 for breakfast. Like it's nothing. A young American soldier sat down at their table, his own breakfast tray even more loaded than theirs. He smiled and said something in English that Greta didn't understand. When he saw their confusion, he pointed to his food, then to theirs, and gave a thumbs up. "He's asking if the food is good," translated Lieutenant Morrison, passing by. "You can say yes or no. He won't be offended either way." Greta found her voice. "Ja," she managed. "Yes." "Very good." The soldier grinned and launched into what was clearly an enthusiastic commentary on the food, despite the language barrier. His genuine friendliness was disarming. This was supposed to be the enemy? This cheerful young man who seemed delighted to share a table with him? Over the next few days, a routine established itself. 3 meals a day, each one abundant beyond belief. Medical checkups, work assignments, nothing too strenuous, mostly cleaning or laundry duties. Recreation time where they could walk around the compound, write letters, or simply sit and talk. And slowly, very slowly, the German women began to put on weight. Their hollowed cheeks filled out slightly. Color returned to their faces. The constant, gnawing hunger that had been their companion for so long began to fade. But with the physical recovery came a more complex emotional reckoning. The realization. 2 weeks into their captivity, Greta stood in the camp library, a small building stocked with books in various languages, including German. She discovered it by accident while walking the compound during recreation time, and now she found herself drawn there frequently, not necessarily to read, but to think. Annalise found her there one afternoon, staring out the window at the American flag flapping in the breeze. "You missed lunch," she said. "Chicken and dumplings today. Real chicken." "I ate," Greta replied, though she hadn't. The truth was, each meal had become more difficult in a way she struggled to articulate. The food was delicious, the portions generous, but something about it made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You're not the only one," Annalise said, sitting down beside her. "Frau Dietrich has been crying every meal. Margit can barely look at the food without feeling guilty. And me." She paused, her voice dropping. "I find myself angry, furiously angry, and I don't even know at whom." Greta turned to face her friend. "The propaganda," she said slowly. "It was all lies. Everything they told us about the enemy, about why we were fighting, about our great destiny. All of it was lies." Was it? Annalise's eyes were haunted. Or was it something worse? Maybe they believed it too. Maybe everyone believed it while we all slowly starved, while our cities burned, while children were sent to die with tank killers on their shoulders. A few other German women had gathered in the library. It had become an unofficial meeting place for those struggling with the same thoughts. Clara, the former nurse, spoke up from where she sat reading a magazine. "I've been talking to some of the American medical staff. Do you know what they told me? Their soldiers get about 4,000 calories a day. 4,000. Meanwhile, Berlin civilians were down to less than 1,000 by the end of 1944. "Stop," whispered Margit, her hands over her ears. "Please stop. I don't want to know." But Clara continued, her voice urgent. "We have to know. Don't you see? We have to understand what was done to us. To Germany. The Americans weren't starving. Britain wasn't starving, not really. Even the Soviets, with half their country destroyed, were managing better than we were. Why? Because our leadership bled the country dry, pursuing an unwinnable war. Careful," warned an older woman, Ingrid, who had been a party member before her capture. "Such talk is dangerous." "Dangerous?" Clara laughed bitterly. "We've already lost everything. What more danger could there possibly be? And besides, look around you. We're prisoners of war, and we're eating better than we did as free German citizens. What does that tell you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Greta thought back to the years of sacrifice, the rationing, the ersatz products, the constant exhortations to give more, endure more, sacrifice more for the Vaterland. And all the while, their leaders had known, they must have known, that the war was unwinnable, that they were sending people to die for nothing. "My brother died at Kursk," Greta said quietly. "Klaus was 19. They told my mother he died a hero, defending the Reich against Bolshevism. But what was he really dying for? so that a handful of men could cling to power a little longer, so that they could take the whole country down with them rather than admit defeat. My husband was killed in France, added Frau Dietrich, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Summer of 1944. And my son, my beautiful boy, was conscripted last fall at 16. 16 years old, sent to fight the Americans. I don't even know if he's alive. She looked down at her hands. And I'm here, eating eggs and bacon and fresh bread, and I don't know if my son had even one decent meal in his last days. The guilt was crushing. It wasn't rational. They knew that, intellectually. They hadn't chosen this war, hadn't created the circumstances that led to Germany's collapse. But the gap between their current situation and what they knew was happening outside the camp walls was impossible to reconcile. There's a film showing tonight, Annalise said after a long silence. The Americans are showing a newsreel about the concentration camps they've liberated. Lieutenant Morrison said we're required to attend. Greta felt a chill run down her spine. They'd heard rumors about the camps, of course. Everyone had. But the rumors have been so extreme, so horrific, that most people dismiss them as enemy propaganda. Surely such things couldn't be real. Surely Germany, however misguided its war, wouldn't. I don't want to go, Margaret said, her voice small and frightened. I don't want to see. I don't think we have a choice, Greta replied. And maybe we shouldn't have a choice. If it's real, if any of it is real, then we need to know. We need to bear witness. That evening, they gathered in a large hall that had been set up with a projection screen. All the German POWs were there, several hundred in total, sitting in uncomfortable silence. American officers lined the walls, their expressions grim and determined. Lieutenant Morrison stood at the front of the room. What you are about to see, she said in German, her voice hard, is real footage shot by American and British forces as they liberated concentration camps across Germany and Poland. This is not propaganda. This is not exaggeration. This is the truth of what was done in your country's name. The lights went down. Truth and consequences. The film lasted 45 minutes, but it felt like hours. Greta sat frozen, unable to look away from the screen despite every instinct screaming at her to close her eyes, to deny what she was seeing. Bodies. Mountains of bodies, skeletal and broken. Living people who looked barely more alive than the dead, their eyes huge in skull-like faces. Children among them, reduced to walking skeletons. The footage from Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau rolled on relentlessly, each frame more damning than the last. American soldiers, these same cheerful, well-fed young men who had been serving them meals and treating them with respect, appeared on screen walking through the camps, their faces twisted in horror and disgust. Some were visibly sick. The cameras showed everything: the gas chambers disguised as showers, the crematoria, the medical experimentation facilities. And the survivors. God, the survivors. They reached toward the cameras with skeletal hands, their eyes hollow with suffering beyond comprehension. The footage showed American medics trying to help, but many were too far gone. The narrator explained in English, translated by Lieutenant Morrison, that even with immediate medical care, thousands had died in the days after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover. Beside Greta, Margaret was sobbing, her whole body shaking. Other women throughout the hall were crying or sitting in stunned silence, or, in a few cases, retching into handkerchiefs. The smell of vomit began to permeate the room. This cannot be real, someone muttered. This is impossible. We would have known. Someone would have told us. But even as the words were spoken, Greta knew they were hollow. They had known, in a way. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not the full extent of the horror, but they had known something was terribly wrong. The disappearances, the whispered stories, the trains that left full and returned empty, the careful avoidance of certain topics, certain questions. They had known, and they had looked away. When the film finally ended and the lights came up, the silence in the room was absolute. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward again, her expression hard but not without compassion. Many of you will say you didn't know, she said. And perhaps, in the strictest sense, that's true. But Germany knew. Your government knew. Your military knew. And now you know. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? No one answered. What answer could possibly be adequate? Later that night, back in the barracks, no one slept. The women sat on their bunks or gathered in small groups, trying to process what they'd seen. Some prayed. Others simply stared into space, shock evident in every line of their bodies. I volunteered, Margaret said suddenly, her voice hollow. When they called for women to serve in the Wehrmacht, I volunteered. I was so proud. My mother cried, but I thought she was just being emotional. I thought I was serving something noble. We all did, Annalise replied. Or most of us, anyway. We believed. We trusted. And now we have to live with it, finished Frau Dietrich. We have to live knowing what we were part of, even if we didn't pull the triggers or open the gas chambers ourselves. We were part of the system that made it possible. But what could we have done? Protested Ingrid. We're just ordinary women. Clerks, nurses, telegraphists. We had no power to change anything. Clara looked up, her eyes red from crying. Maybe not, but we could have refused to participate. We could have spoken up, even knowing the risks. Instead, we did our jobs, kept our heads down, and told ourselves it wasn't our responsibility. The conversation continued through the night, going in circles, finding no comfort and no answers. Each woman had to wrestle with her own conscience, her own complicity, her own guilt. Greta thought about the meals they'd been served, the abundance that had seemed so overwhelming. Now it took on a new, bitter significance. The Americans had food to spare because their country hadn't spent years pursuing a genocidal war. Their soldiers were well-fed because their leadership actually cared about their welfare. Their prisoners ate well because they recognized a basic standard of human dignity that Germany had abandoned. The food that had seemed like such a luxury now felt like an indictment. In the days that followed, a change came over the camp. The German women still ate the meals provided. They had little choice, and starving themselves wouldn't undo what had been done. But the earlier amazement and gratitude gave way to a somber recognition of what that abundance represented. Some of the women, particularly the younger ones like Margaret, struggled with severe depression. Others, like Ingrid, retreated into denial, insisting that the films had been fabricated or exaggerated. Most, like Greta, simply tried to find a way to keep living while carrying the weight of this new knowledge. The Americans, for their part, continued to treat them well, but with a new distance. The casual friendliness of those first weeks was gone, replaced by professional courtesy. The guards and staff had seen the same films, had in many cases witnessed the camps firsthand. They knew what regime these women had served, however peripherally. Yet the food kept coming. 3 meals a day, nutritious and abundant. Medical care continued. The basic standards of the Geneva Convention were maintained, even for prisoners of a state that had systematically violated every principle of human decency. Why? Greta asked Lieutenant Morrison one day during her shift in the camp laundry. Why do you treat us so well? After what you've seen, what Germany did, why? Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Because someone has to break the cycle, she said finally. Because treating you with cruelty wouldn't honor the memory of those who died. It would just perpetuate the same evil. We're better than that. We have to be better than that. Letters home. 3 months into their captivity, the German women were allowed to send letters home. The announcement brought mixed reactions. Some were eager to contact family members to let them know they were alive and relatively well. Others, like Greta, struggled with what to say. How could she write to her mother about eating roast beef and mashed potatoes while her mother was likely subsisting on ration cards in the ruins of Cologne? How could she describe the abundance of the American POW camp without sounding like she was rubbing salt in the wounds of those still suffering in defeated Germany? Greta sat in the library with a pen and paper, trying to find the right words. Around her, other women were similarly engaged, some writing quickly while others, like her, stared at blank pages. Dear Mama, she began, I am alive and well, held as a prisoner of the Americans. We are being treated according to international law. Please do not worry about me. It sounded so formal, so distant. But what else could she say? The truth, that she was eating better than she had in years, that she was warm and safe while Germany froze and starved, seemed obscene. Anneliese, sitting nearby, was crying over her own letter. "My sister has 3 children," she said. "The youngest is just 2 years old. What am I supposed to tell her? That I'm fine while her children are probably hungry? That I feel guilty for eating eggs?" "Tell her you love her," Frau Dietrich suggested gently. "Tell her you're alive. The rest will sort itself out when the war is over." The war was, indeed, definitively over now. News had reached the camp. Germany had surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. Hitler was dead, suicide in his bunker. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed after just 12. Berlin was occupied by the Soviets. The country was being divided up by the Allied powers. For many of the women, the surrender brought a strange mixture of relief and grief. The dying would stop, but so too had any semblance of the Germany they had known. Everything they had believed in, fought for, sacrificed for, it was all gone, revealed as the hollow lie it had always been. "What happens to us now?" Margaret asked during lunch one day. They were eating chicken soup with actual chunks of chicken, fresh vegetables, and soft noodles. A simple meal by American standards, but still luxurious by German wartime measures. "Eventually, we'll be repatriated," Clara explained. She'd been talking to the American medical staff, practicing her English. "Sent back to Germany. But not right away. Germany is—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Germany is devastated. There's not enough food, not enough housing, not enough anything. The Americans don't want to send us back until there's something to send us back to. So we stay here," Greta said, "eating American food, warm and safe, while our country suffers. Would it help anyone if we were suffering too?" Anneliese asked, though her tone suggested she was asking herself as much as the others. Would our hunger feed anyone else? It was the question they all wrestled with. The guilt of surviving, of being comfortable, of being fed while others starved. Survivor's guilt, Clara called it, a term she'd learned from the American psychiatrist who visited the camp weekly to check on the prisoners' mental health. The American psychiatrist, Dr. Reynolds, was a middle-aged man with patient eyes and surprisingly good German. He conducted voluntary sessions with any prisoners who wanted to talk. Initially, few took him up on the offer. Psychiatry was not widely accepted in Germany, often viewed with suspicion. But gradually, as the weight of their situation became harder to bear alone, more women began attending. Greta found herself in his office one afternoon, not entirely sure how she'd ended up there. They sat in comfortable chairs with cups of coffee between them. Real coffee, always real coffee with the Americans. "Tell me what you're feeling," Dr. Reynolds said simply. And somehow Greta did. She told him about the shock of that first meal, the abundance that had seemed like a dream. She told him about the guilt that grew with each well-fed day, about the nightmares that had started after watching the concentration camp footage, about the letters she couldn't write because the words felt like betrayal. "You're grieving," Dr. Reynolds said when she finished. "Grieving for the country you thought you lived in, for the beliefs you held, for the innocence you've lost. That's normal. That's human. How do I live with it?" Greta asked. "How do I live knowing what was done? What I was part of, even if I didn't know, even if I never hurt anyone directly?" "You live by being better," he replied. "By learning from this, by refusing to ever let it happen again, by bearing witness and telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." The conversation stayed with Greta long after the session ended. That night, she returned to her letter, starting fresh. "Dear Mama," she wrote, "I am alive and safe. I know that may be hard to hear when things are so difficult at home, and I'm sorry for whatever pain this causes. But I want you to know the truth of what I've learned here. I want to tell you about the lies we believed, the evil that was done in our name. I want to tell you so that we never forget, so that we never let it happen again. This letter will be long, and some of it will be painful to read. But I need to write it, and I think you need to read it, because we owe that much to all those who died." And then, carefully, painfully, she began to write the truth. Forward. August 1945 brought news that the war with Japan had also ended, this time through the use of weapons so terrible that Greta could barely comprehend them when she heard the reports. Entire cities destroyed in single blasts. It seemed the world had discovered new depths of horror, even as it was still processing the old ones. But for the German POWs in the American camp, August brought something else, the beginning of repatriation planning. They would eventually be going home, or rather, to what was left of home. The news brought mixed feelings. Greta sat with her friends during dinner, pork chops with applesauce, green beans, dinner rolls, and tried to imagine leaving this place. After 4 months of regular meals, she had gained 20 pounds and looked healthy for the first time in years. Many of the women had similar transformations. They no longer looked like the gaunt, desperate creatures who had been captured in spring. "What do you think it will be like?" Margaret asked. She was 18 now, having celebrated a birthday marked by a cake the American cooks made especially for her. A real cake with frosting. "Going back, hard," Frau Dietrich said simply. "Very hard, but necessary." They had all heard the reports from Germany. The cities were in ruins. Food was scarce, housing even more so. The Allies were providing some relief supplies, but there wasn't enough to go around. Millions of displaced persons were trying to find their way home or to somewhere safe. The economy had collapsed. The currency was nearly worthless. Black markets flourished. Disease was spreading. And over it all hung the shadow of collective guilt. The world now knew what Germany had done, and the judgment was harsh and unforgiving. "I've been thinking," Annalise said quietly, "about what I'll do when I get back. I was training to be a teacher before the war. Maybe I can do that again. Teach the next generation differently. Make sure they know the truth. If they let you," Ingrid pointed out. She had aged considerably since that night. They'd watched the concentration camp films, her earlier defiance crushed under the weight of undeniable evidence. The Allies might not let former Wehrmacht members teach. "Then I'll do something else," Annalise replied with determination. "But whatever I do, I won't be silent. I won't pretend this never happened." Greta admired her friend's conviction, even as she struggled to find her own sense of purpose. What did one do with the knowledge they now carried? How did you build a life on the ruins of everything you believed in? Over the following weeks, the Americans organized educational programs for the POWs. German language classes on democracy, on human rights, on the history that had been distorted by Nazi propaganda. Some prisoners resisted, clinging to the old beliefs, but most attended, hungry for truth after years of lies. Greta found herself particularly drawn to the classes on civic responsibility and governance. She learned about checks and balances, about the importance of a free press, about how democracies were supposed to work. It was fascinating and more than a little damning, how different the American system was from what Germany had become under Hitler. "The thing you have to understand," the instructor, a professor from an American university, told them in fluent German, "is that democracy requires active participation. It's not enough to vote and then let others make all the decisions. Citizens have a responsibility to stay informed, to speak up, to hold their leaders accountable. When people become passive, when they stop questioning authority, when they value order over justice, that's when tyrants rise." The words resonated deeply with Greta. How many times had she or others around her stayed silent when they had doubts? How often had they accepted convenient lies rather than demanding difficult truths? In September, a group of American journalists visited the camp to interview the German POWs for an article about the re-education process. Greta volunteered to be interviewed, partly out of curiosity about how Americans viewed them, partly out of a growing sense that speaking out was important. The journalist, a woman named Sarah Cohen, sat across from her with a notebook and a kind but penetrating gaze. "Tell me," she said, "what was your reaction when you first arrived here and saw the abundance of food?" Greta thought carefully before answering. "Shock," she said honestly. "Complete shock. We had been told that America was struggling, that the war was bleeding them dry just as it was bleeding Germany. To see the truth, that they had plenty, that they could feed their prisoners better than we fed our own people. It was like having the ground pulled out from under us. And after you learned about the concentration camps," Sarah's voice was gentle but firm, "how did that change your perspective?" "It made me understand that the food was just the tip of the iceberg, Greta replied. The abundance, the better treatment, it wasn't just about resources. It was about values, about basic human dignity, about recognizing that even enemies are human beings deserving of decent treatment. Germany lost that somewhere along the way. We stopped seeing certain people as human, and once you do that, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah nodded, writing quickly. What will you do when you return to Germany? I don't know yet, Greta admitted, but I know I have a responsibility to remember, to bear witness, to make sure that what happened is never forgotten or denied. My generation failed Germany. We let ourselves be led into evil. The next generation deserves better. They deserve the truth. The interview was published in October, reaching American readers who were trying to understand how a cultured, educated nation like Germany had descended into barbarism. Greta's words were quoted extensively, along with those of several other prisoners who had volunteered to speak. Finally, in late November, the first group of POWs received their repatriation orders. Greta was in the second wave, scheduled to leave in early December. As the departure date approached, she felt an unexpected sadness. This camp, which had started as a prison, had become something else, a place of reckoning, certainly, but also of recovery and education. On her last night, Greta stood in the dining hall one final time, looking at the serving line that had so shocked her months ago. Tomorrow she would return to a Germany where such abundance was still a distant dream. She would face shortages, ruins, and the harsh judgment of a world that now knew the full extent of German crimes. But she would also face it with clear eyes and hard-won knowledge. She understood now what happened when people surrendered their judgment to authority, when they chose comfortable lies over difficult truths, when they allowed themselves to see some humans as less than human. Lieutenant Morrison found her there, standing alone. Ready to go home? She asked in German. I don't know if Germany is home anymore, Greta replied honestly. The Germany I knew is gone. We'll have to build something new. Then build something better, Morrison said. Learn from what happened. Make sure it never happens again. They called this lunch, Greta said suddenly, gesturing at the serving area. That first day, I couldn't believe it. So much food, and you called it lunch like it was nothing special. Morrison smiled sadly. It was just lunch. That's the point, isn't it? It shouldn't be remarkable to feed people decently. That should be the baseline of human civilization. The next morning, Greta boarded a transport truck along with 50 other German women. They were given packages of food for the journey, sandwiches, fruit, chocolate bars. Even now, even at the very end, the Americans made sure they were fed. As the truck pulled away from the camp, Greta looked back one last time. Then she turned to face forward, toward whatever future awaited in a defeated and devastated Germany. She carried with her hard lessons learned and a determination to do better, to be better. The war was over. The real work was just beginning. Years later, Greta would become a teacher in the new West Germany, dedicated to ensuring her students understood the truth of their nation's history. Anneliese became a social worker, helping to rebuild communities and care for war orphans. Margit studied law and became an advocate for human rights. Frau Dietrich found her son alive, returned from American captivity, and they rebuilt their lives together in Munich. They never forgot that spring of 1945, when they discovered that the enemy they'd been taught to hate had treated them with more humanity than their own leaders. The memory of that first lunch, of roast beef and mashed potatoes, of butter and milk and fresh bread, became a touchstone, a reminder of the lies they believed and the truths they'd learned. They had called it lunch. Just lunch. But it had been so much more. It had been the beginning of understanding, the first crack in the edifice of propaganda, the moment when reality had broken through years of indoctrination. They told their stories to anyone who would listen, bearing witness to both the evil that had been done and the unexpected grace that had been shown. They lived long lives in a Germany that slowly, painfully rebuilt itself on different foundations. And they never took a meal for granted again.